And thank you very much to the organisers of Global Table for having us. Now, I'd like to welcome my friends and colleagues to the stage, Dalene Wray from OBE Organics, Barry McGookin from FIAL, Food Innovation Australia Limited, Amy Guihot from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and Martin Squire from the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science. And it is a very exciting day for the Export Council and FIAL. We have had a labour of love for probably over 18 months, 3 years. Wow. Yes, that is a long labour period. And today is the launch of an innovative new tool called the Trade Barriers Register. Now, this was born from the fact that when we talk to exporters, and Chris touched on this before, there are so many opportunities out there, but sometimes it feels like every time you try and pursue those opportunities, you hit a brick wall. And it's just something that, it could be a small thing, it could be something seemingly insignificant, but when you hit that wall, it just kills your momentum and stops you dead. And that's one of the issues that we come up against time and time again for businesses that are trying to do their best to diversify their markets, to reduce their risk, to seize global opportunities. They just come up against these small things and it stops them in their tracks. So we got together. I'm sort of head the Export Council of Australia. We're an industry-based organisation. We do primarily two things: provide the skills and capabilities for businesses to help them get out of Australia. And the other thing is we are a membership-based organisation, so we provide advice, networks, and we also advocate on their behalf to make it simpler and cheaper to export. And one of the things we're constantly coming up against was businesses trying to find information on workarounds, on how to address trade barriers, things that get in the way of you doing business internationally. What are the workarounds, and what are the things that you wished you had known when you started out on your journey that's really sort of brought you to that standstill? So we were discussing this with FIAL, who are very close partners of ours, and we were saying, wouldn't it be great if there was some way of capturing those barriers and making them known to government so that government can address the barriers that government can address, and making them known to industry so that industry can have visibility of what's coming up ahead. And that's where the idea of the Trade Barriers Register was born. And it's been quite a long process to get it right, but we're finally at that stage, and it's gone live today, and you've seen up on the screen what it looks like. So it's a partnership with FIAL and the Industry Growth Centres, facilitated in support with the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science. And we're going to be partnering with the Department of Foreign Affairs, and Amy will talk about their role in a minute. So why don't we jump into it? I think, Barry, you're going to have a touch on what's covered and why we're doing this Trade Barrier Register in a bit more detail, what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you for that. So, a really good summary that you've given us, Heath, and so thank you for that. What we're trying to do is to make it, give everybody in industry an opportunity to be able to comment. One of the things that we have found at Food Innovation Australia is that there is a lot of knowledge that companies have that doesn't go anywhere because there is no place for that knowledge to go. And as an industry-based organisation that is committed to helping small companies and large companies, but everybody who is in the business of being successful, be more successful, having a place to have a voice is important, particularly when you can't find who you need to talk to. So the Trade Barriers Register gives you an opportunity to tell your story, your challenge, in a way that shows the real life pain and challenges that you're going through, in order for that information to be collected together and as a collective voice be given to government and others who are making policy decisions and regulatory decisions to help them understand the implications of some of the things that's going on. As Heath also mentioned, training is important. Many companies know that they're good at doing export, but how do they become better? And without knowing where those gaps are that can improve the capabilities for your organisation, and the only way we know that is if you tell us where the gaps are, we can't create something that gives benefit back to the industry. So not only is it a place of capturing challenges, but it's a case of capturing opportunities so that we collectively can create new ways of helping you learn and grow your business. Just as an example of one of the things that happened with the Trade Barrier Register, and it's not specifically an export example, although export companies were involved, fire insurance. Many organisations that produce food have to use, by local council laws, sandwich panelling, which is styrofoam panelling, either side of which is plastic. That is a high fire risk material, but you have to use it because of the local government guidelines. In some cases, the fire insurance has actually matched the year's return for those organisations, and therefore they haven't been able to make a profit simply because they have to be able to pay their fire insurance because they were told they have to have sandwich panelling. We've collected that information and passed that back to the government to say there needs to be some sort of change in the building code standards to allow for a different fire registration and different types of materials to be used for food manufacturers, or we will have more companies go out of business because the restrictions to trade from a regulatory impost was unknown at the time. So it's a very practical place to you can put your own stories in to tell others about how they can help and take away some of the challenges that you might face.
Well, awesome. Thanks, Barry. Now, I'd like to welcome Dalene Wray from OBE Organics. Dalene's the Managing Director, and OBE Organics is the oldest and best exporter of organic beef in Australia. Dalene is also more passionate about trade barriers than anyone I have ever met, so was the natural person to invite onto the panel. So can I get you to give a few examples of your experience?
Thanks, Heath. So I am from Birdsville in Western Queensland in the outback, and Obi was born in a little town nearby called Thargomindah about 25 years ago. So we're a group of family farmers that now export. We have cattle that are raised in the outback. They're processed at a facility near Brisbane, and we export all over the world. So Heath did ask me to come along. It's my hobby to think about technical trade barriers and how we can fix them, because I run into them all the time in my role as the boss of an organic beef company. I'll give you a little example. We're very attuned to Austrade and all the opportunities that they present. Recently, I started to hear them talk about opportunities in Latin America. Opportunities in Latin America are incredible for Australian businesses, particularly meat businesses, because the tariff has recently reduced to zero. I heard this from Austrade. We went to Mexico in October and we thought, awesome, we got ourselves a customer. We decided to launch recently, and we partnered. We needed to send our first order in. So you can imagine this has been a process. It's a $10,000 order. We're going to launch at the Australian Ambassador's residence in Mexico. What do you need to export to Mexico? You need to have export certification. You need to have the right labels on your cartons. So we go to the normal website with the Australian government to find out what type of information you need to export to Mexico, and the website says export at your own risk. So what that means is the tariffs have only recently reduced to zero, which means that Australian exporters really haven't been able to export beef there previously. So it's understandable that the Australian government doesn't have a repository of information. So we said, this is easy. I'll just WhatsApp a mate of mine that's exporting beef there already, and I'll ask him to WhatsApp me a photo of what should be on the end panel label of the carton, which he did. And it was clear that I needed to translate into Spanish and English the labels, which we did. We got them approved in Mexico. We sent the product in 10 days out of our launch. We were launching at the Australian Ambassador's residence in Mexico. 10 days out, really smart move, wasn't it? Yes, of course there won't be any problems. Rejected at Mexico Customs because two reasons. The Spanish and English was meant to be on top of each other instead of one Spanish label and one English label. Again, product's worth $10,000. We're launching at the Australian Ambassador's residence. We've got 50 chefs coming and influencers. Day 9, day 8, day 7, day 6, we can't clear. We also had an issue with the health certificate that we weren't aware of. The product cleared 12 hours before the launch, and it involved us having a handwritten letter from the Australian ambassador to the appropriate customs services in Mexico. So I just wanted to give you that practical example that there are SMEs and there are exporters like us that are exploring these opportunities in exports, and we come into these things, and it's by no one's fault that there's no information. We need a place that we can inform the government. Please, get your diplomats to put information into this repository so that there are businesses like ours that don't stumble.
And so that's a great example, and some of you are probably sitting there thinking, okay, well that's chilled and frozen meats, that doesn't apply to me. That's fine. I do processed food. So Lawrence from McCain's, who said he'd come, but he can probably hear me. So Lawrence, come over. They make frozen pizzas because that's what McCain's do, but they would love to export them and can't because there is beef or pork on their pizzas. So it's not just people who are trying to sell cuts of meat or carcasses of meat. It's if you've got a tiny little bit of meat in your product, if you're a supplements company and you use gelatin, you've got to have in Spanish and English one on top of the other, and this health certificate, even though there's no risk of anything if it's in gelatin form, you're not going to get BSE from gelatin, but it is exactly the same process that McCain's got to go to, or a supplements company. Swiss is over there as well. They'd be dealing with the same thing. So it will impact people in ways that they just hadn't imagined. So this is the sort of thing. It's where you have the same piece of regulation affecting a meat exporter, a manufactured food exporter, and a supplements exporter. So I'll go to Martin from the Department of Industry. Martin's the General Manager of Trade and International at the Department of Industry. And I'll get you to explain, Martin, what it is that you guys do to reduce barriers to trade.
Sure. Thanks very much, Heath. So there's probably three things I'll touch on. The first is around technical infrastructure. The second is around negotiating of free trade agreements, and then finally dealing with free trade agreements once they've been concluded. So as part of my role, we support Standards Australia to the tune of around $2.5 million a year to participate in international standard setting. So the reason I raise this is one of the most effective ways to deal with a technical barrier to trade is to prevent them from occurring in the first place. So, 1 in 5 jobs in Australia is directly linked to exports. We're a trading nation. So the government's taken a policy of adopting international standards wherever possible. So that $2.5 million allows for industry representatives to participate in international standard setting so that we can then trade more freely with our international trading partners. Similarly to Standards Australia, we also support an organisation called NATA. This is a very acronym-rich environment. NATA is the National Association of Testing Authorities. So they essentially do all of the conformity assessment testing for laboratories, similar to the standards side. So they are, developing the processes for determining or assessing how well laboratories are undertaking testing. The reason I mention that is because we can allow for, through mutual recognition agreements, to allow for testing in Australia, for example, to be accepted by partners overseas. So that's a very big way of reducing costs to exporters, to ensure that a test certificate that you've obtained in Australia is accepted in China, or Singapore, or the UK, or the EU, for example, and likewise in return that we accept products that have been tested in overseas laboratories. The third organisation I'm on the board of, which is JASANTS, which is the Joint Accreditation System of Australia and New Zealand, which does a similar thing, but we've got a very good mutual recognition agreement with New Zealand. In fact, it's world leading, which pretty much says if it's acceptable to be sold in Australia, it's fit to be sold in New Zealand and vice versa. On the free trade negotiation side, and we heard earlier from the EU delegation about geographical indications, So I focus very much on the goods side of a free trade agreement discussion. So that's issues around market access. It's around technical barriers to trade. It's around rules of origin, for example. So ensuring that the rules of origin for our exports are to the extent where it's possible to negotiate this, are consistent across agreements, so that industry has to deal with the same set of rules across various free trade agreements in demonstrating that something is a product of Australia. Finally, with free trade agreements that we have established, there's inbuilt committee structures, for example. So I co-chair with my Chinese counterpart the Technical Barriers Trade Committee under the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. It's a bit of a mouthful as well. And that committee has met once to date and looked at some particular issues Australian exporters were having in exporting product, particularly around coal, complementary medicines, and also medical devices to China. So we've got a couple of pathways which we use to prevent or try and reduce the risk of technical barriers to trade arising in the first place, and that's where the department's putting its efforts in. But my colleague Amy will speak more about the whole of government approach which we're supporting to addressing trade barriers that do exist.
Great, and I certainly hope that one meeting you had with China was a very long one, because there's a fair bit to discuss. Amy's the Assistant Secretary of the Agriculture and Food branch in DFAT. I think people generally think about the Department of Agriculture when it comes to market access, especially on the agriculture and food side of things. Can you give us a bit of an explanation of what DFAT's role in this is? And you also have your team has a role that's not in that title, so can you that revolves around non-tariff barriers. Can I get you to explain what that is as well, please?
Sure, thanks very much. So as Assistant Secretary for Agriculture and Food Trade, I work really closely with my colleagues in Department of Agriculture to try and make sure that the Australian government is addressing industry's key market access issues. So that's across the board in numerous markets. DFAT doesn't lead these negotiations. The Department of Agriculture usually leads the negotiations on agricultural market access, but often DFAT can complement the activities that Department of Agriculture does. In addition, we also work on global world trade as well, so particularly through the World Trade Organisation and the Committee on Agriculture. So I am the lead negotiator, agriculture negotiator for the Australian Government in terms of the World Trade Organisation Committee on Agriculture. But we also work closely with the Department of Agriculture, who leads on the sanitary and phytosanitary, which covers your animal, plant health, food safety issues through the WTO as well. The other hat I wear that you alluded to before is around non-tariff barriers. So as we've heard from a couple of people today, in terms of free trade agreements, the Australian government's doing pretty well. Back in 2013, around just shy of 27% of our trade was covered by a free trade agreement. Now we're looking at nearly 80%, just shy of 80% of our trade is covered by free trade agreements, and that will rise again as we continue to negotiate free trade agreements with the EU and with RCEP, which is all the ASEAN countries plus India, China, Japan, Korea. So there's a number of free trade agreements that are providing tariff cuts to our exporters. But when we did consultations for the government's foreign policy white paper, we heard very strongly from industry groups that while the free trade agreements were very welcome and very useful, what was actually stopping them accessing markets were non-tariff barriers. And some of these non-tariff barriers can add up to 3 times the cost of trade. So they actually have more of an impact in some markets than tariffs or quotas or safeguards. So the government made a commitment through the Foreign Policy White Paper to look more closely at non-tariff barriers and how we can have a whole-of-government approach to addressing these. So while I'm sitting here for Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and my section has the non-tariff barriers team within it, we have Department of Industry, Department of Agriculture, Austrade, Department of Home Affairs, all working with us on this project. We launched last year the Non-Tariff Barriers Action Plan, and we also have a Non-Tariff Barriers portal, which is complementary to the one that was launched today by the Export Council of Australia, to try and define where we fit versus where others might fit. I think actually the Export Council of Australia has a really good diagram that shows trade barriers as a really big block, which is anything that's preventing people from accessing markets. Within that, there are non-tariff measures, which is what governments overseas might put in place in order to manage the risk of pests and diseases, food safety, things like labelling, things like certification, health checks, those kind of things are non-tariff measures. And primarily Department of Agriculture leads on addressing non-tariff measures. But when we turn to non-tariff barriers, that's where those non-tariff measures become unreasonable, lengthy, inconsistent, and where they're becoming problematic across industries or in multiple markets or across an industry in one market. And that's where we would like to try and focus our attention in terms of pulling the whole of government effort and working hand in glove with industry and trying to address those.
Fantastic. Thanks, Amy. Now, Martin, you spoke about standards before. I'm just going to put you on the spot here. There was a really great piece of work done with the Indonesia free trade agreements that was really to try and map out the standards that were impeding business. Are you able to talk to that at all?
Not to a great extent, Heath. But part of the conclusion or the negotiations around the Indonesia-Australia Free Trade Agreement was some money that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is looking after, but is going to look at sort of reducing or addressing those capabilities. So Standards Australia, which is sort of independent of government, undertook that work for Foreign Affairs and Trade as part of the support package, if you like, around the Indonesia-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which is again another demonstration of the government's commitment to try and encourage Australian exporters to take advantage of the free trade agreement opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to these sort of trade barriers, I can absolutely vouch for the government that they are really keen to try and help out. They're faced with two issues, though. So issue number one is that a lot of these things are a negotiation, and while the Australian government's keen to negotiate, the partner government might be less so. They've got their own priorities. They've got their own, things that they want to deal with. So their capacity to hear them can be a bit limited. But the other issue is that the government just doesn't know what you're facing. And while, there might be these sort of agriculture to agriculture conversations that might be a bit stalled, there could be a few other discussions that could be had through various other mechanisms to address some of those. So I think it's worth just putting it out there, because you never know, essentially. There might be an issue that people just didn't know about. That's a really, a fairly straightforward fix. And it wasn't addressed. It's been costing you money because the government just didn't know about it. So raise your issues. That's what this is all about, just sort of raising it, because we're not going to guarantee we're going to solve every problem. And especially in Dalene's case, we are not in a position to turn around that request in 10 days. If you've got your launch, we can't get the ambassador in Mexico to send a letter.
We launched.
So
there's a lot of people that didn't get much sleep.
If you're after Hit, my advice would be, whenever you go overseas to visit your clients, go and talk to the Australian government, so the Australian Embassy, be it Austrade, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, or the Department of Agriculture, because you just never know when that mobile phone is going to come in really handy. So that is my key piece of advice for you. Dalene, now... Yes,
Can I
please?
step in and just give an example here? So I want to implore the people in the audience to use this portal. We need feedback from you. Is it fun to use? It probably won't be, but anyway, we hope it is. Keep going. Don't use the excuse you haven't got time, you're too busy, there's no one in the office to do it. Oh, the time's passed, I fixed it, I won't worry about it. I'll give you this example. Last year we had a container of meat that we decided to send by sea instead of air into Dubai. At the time, the shelf life requirements, importing country requirements were 90 days, and they also had this other little thing that required the product had to arrive with more than 50% of its shelf life. So a 90-day shelf life means I had to have it arrive in Dubai port at day 45. If it got to day 46, when it arrived, I was in trouble. We had some issues with halal certification in Australia, which meant this container arrived on day 46, which is less than half its shelf life. We had to get the Australian government involved to help us clear that container. It was worth about $85,000, which is not that much in beef. I had to give my customer a $35,000 discount because he was right in saying this is going to cause me lots of problems to move this product. You're giving me less than half its shelf life to move it. So $85,000 load cost me $35,000 claim. Now, when Heath asked me to come up here at my own cost, I will do this 10 times for Heath and the government because I don't ever want to do that again. It cost me a lot of money and I never want to have to pay a $35,000 claim. This example that I gave you in Mexico, I was on my way over. I had to hand carry the health certificate with me and land in Mexico City Airport at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon and hand it to a Mexican who then got the product cleared at 11 o'clock at night for our launch at 6 o'clock the next day. And I don't want to have to do that. We're better off together. We need to help each other and make sure that we're taking time to log our issues, even if they don't seem very important. And do you know what? I'm riding on the coattails of other exporters, and I'm not talking about beef exporters. If I go into Mexico to pitch to a retailer my chilled beef, and they're already bringing in dairy from Australia, they're already bringing in grain products, they're already bringing in Carmen's muesli bars, and they've had a really nice experience with Australian exporters, I'm better off. So we need to do this together. I really want to encourage you to use the website, talk to your peers, and also talk to your peak industry bodies and ask them to get on board as well.
Absolutely. Now, Barry, I know you've also got some international trade experience doing some actual exporting. Can you perhaps run us through some of the curly problems that you faced?
So one that springs to mind was I was trying to export sausages into Japan, and there was an ingredient that we were using that is in our food standards, but it wasn't in the Japanese food standards. And everybody had agreed that we would be able to take the sausages if we could get that one ingredient approved in the Japanese food standards. And with the help of some of our government colleagues, we were able to get it not quite gazetted, but it was legal enough for us to be able to put our first shipment into Japan. The ongoing challenge of having that formal gazetting of the ingredient between our two countries took much longer than we expected it to, but we wouldn't have been able to get even a test case into the market without having that cross-barrier information made visible to the government so that they could actually do something proactive to help about it. So it was the visibility so that we could collectively work together that made things useful. One of the other ones in shipping processed cheese into the Middle East, we had a glass that we were using from Australia that was coming from France, but the standard of the minerals in the glass was not approved in the Middle East. And that was just simply then ended up being a phone call between the providers and the Middle East was UAE. They went, oh, well, if it's approved in the EU, then we'll be able to approve it here. But nobody had ever asked them that question. It just hadn't appeared because nobody had actually put the question forward for somebody to do something with. And until it was raised to a visibility level, and it was solved like within a day, nobody knew. So I absolutely agree. Telling people what you're facing is important so you can actually do something proactive about it.
Absolutely. Now, Amy, you were the agricultural counsellor in Vietnam as well, so you must have seen some pretty interesting things. And what's your most interesting case, and how did you... It sounds like a job interview. And how did you resolve it?
Okay, so I think there's a couple that come to mind, but certainly the issue that Dalene raised, and also you raised around the government requirements and understanding those clearly are pretty key. So there were numerous times where I would get contacted to try and work out what are the actual requirements by the Vietnamese government for exporting commodity X into this market. And we could quite often find out what those are because the Vietnamese are very good at documenting all the requirements. But what we couldn't always tell is how they applied those requirements. We could say this is what the regulations say, but when it comes to practice, we relied a lot on industry to tell us how they're applied at the border. And sometimes, because of the nature of Vietnam and the way that it trades, we didn't always get that information back. So I guess it's something for industries to keep in mind is that feeding that information back to government about how what happens in practice at the border can be really useful for us in trying to work out what the biggest issues are for industries as well.
Yeah, and I remember when the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement came into place, there are a whole heap of issues that we were hearing from our members about the certificates of origin. So Martin mentioned certificates of origin before. They're basically the thing in an FTA that says, okay, that's Australian enough to pass under the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. It's just because we're not going to let New Zealand products into the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement benefits. We need to have a way of working out what's Australian. And we just hear all these problems from exporters about, I'm stuck on the dock because the certificate's, valid in this port but not this port, and, coming up against this problem. And then the banks were sort of saying, it just doesn't quite match what we need in order to do our trade finance. And I don't know, we're sort of starting to hear these various things, and I'm sure other industry associations were able to, hearing these various things as well. And I think it was a sort of a chance conversation that, it just sort of connected with government. We just assumed that the government knew that these problems were occurring, and this was probably a couple of months in, and there was a sort of a light bulb of joining the dots, if you can have a light bulb joining the dots, but of putting these pieces together that says, okay, we've got a systemic problem here. And then it went back and sort of revisited, what was actually happening on the Chinese side and helping resolve some of those things. So really, when we're talking about this trade barriers register, this is the sort of thing that we're trying to identify, trying to sort of get ahead of the curve, that's not going to require, a sort of a room full of people that just sort of happen to be, the conversation happens to touch on certificates of origin and the right people in the room to sort of work out what's happening. This is trying to put in place a sort of a systemic process for addressing these things. Now, I should also mention, it's not just for exports, it's also for imports, it's also for domestic trade. So whether it's you getting your products out of Australia, or getting it around Australia. So these are the sort of things that we're trying to work out. And Martin, you guys are responsible for the importing policy as well. Can I get you to touch on that?
That's right, Heath.
I should say before you start, what we see as other countries being difficult, I can guarantee you that they see us as being difficult for the same reasons too. So, Martin.
So thanks, Heath. That's a good point. And one of the challenges of operating in this space is working out, what is legitimate government action to protect its particular biodiversity or environment, quarantine restrictions and so on, and then what are rules or regulations that aren't as Amy's suggested, aren't applied consistently, or they're applied in an inconsistent manner across a country, but also trying to identify where the application of technical barriers to trade is done in a way which we wouldn't consider to be the most efficient way. You mentioned certificates of origin, which is a good example. In a free trade agreement discussion, Australia will always push for self-certification for certificates of origin, but for a lot of other countries, they're not prepared to accept the word of a producer or manufacturer. They'll either rely entirely, for example, on an export certificate from our Department of Agriculture, or they'll ask for a certificate of origin in some of our free trade agreements issued by an industry association. the focus very much is on exporting and sort of on the portal in terms of identifying barriers to export. But equally, the industry department, which I'm representing here today, is also very interested in, what are the less than ideal things that we do to ourselves, which make it more difficult to export. So there's a whole host of activity across government trying to address that. So through single window for trade, for example, we have the National Committee on Trade Facilitation, which is trying to identify what are the systemic issues, or what are the barriers that Australia, state and territory governments, what are the barriers that we've imposed upon ourselves, which aren't done in the most efficient manner, and then. I'd also sort of like to thank Dalene for sharing her example and really encourage industry to bring your cases forward, because it really is that evidence that we need around what's the materiality, what's the cost, is it just is it a legitimate action of a foreign government in terms of protecting their environment, or is it being done in a way that's inconsistent, ad hoc, or adding unnecessary burdens? I had Craig Laundy as the Assistant Minister for the Industry, went to China at short notice to deal with some issues around exports of chilled beef, where the label on the inside of the box didn't match the label on the outside of the box. Now we might see that as petty, but that's the importing country's requirements. We weren't meeting those as exporters. We weren't meeting those requirements, but resolving those issues afterwards is very, very difficult.
And I just want to also just talk about what we're going to be doing with this portal from our business. One thing you have to think about is swallowing your ego. So with technical trade barriers, in my experience, 100% of the mistakes we make are our fault at OB Organic. So our logistics coordinator or our sales manager or I have provided the wrong instructions, or put an A instead of a B, or a 1 instead of a 2. You can name it. We've had all of them. And 100% of the time, we've misinterpreted something, we didn't listen, we got it wrong, we put a B instead of an A. And we need to go to the government. The product arrives somewhere from Riyadh to Hong Kong, or anywhere in between, and it hits customs and it doesn't clear. So we need to get the diplomats involved. So what we do is when it costs us quite a bit of money, we write a case study and we send it around to whoever wants to listen. We swallow our ego and say, we made a mistake, we did this, but gee, it'd be so much easier if we didn't have to put the A and B on the health certificate in the first place. When I talk to government, and I get frustrated sometimes, and I say, why aren't you doing anything about it? And they said, yeah, we know it's an issue, but we've heard it 10 times, there's bigger issues. And I said, well, this issue cost me $35,000. If you knew that there were 10 meat exporters that had paid $35,000 claims this month for exactly the same issue, which is now $350,000 burden on Australian beef exporters to Dubai, would that matter? And they said, oh yes, it'd be much more important. But how do they know that? Because we have egos and we don't want to tell people that we made a mistake, and we don't want to tell anyone that it cost us $35,000, because we look completely stupid, right, for making that mistake in the first place. But that's what we need to do, and we need to log things that seem minor, the things that frustrate you when your logistics coordinators make mistakes, or you can't keep a logistics coordinator and you have these rules and they don't follow it when you get a temp in, right? It's those mistakes that they keep making that we need to log, so that someone in the ECA or the government hopefully looks at it and says, why do we have to put that on the health certificate in the first place? Or why do we need that 10th certificate that says the same thing as the other 9 certificates we've just created? So really encourage you to think about what you can do with your teams to log things that seem relatively minor to you, but as a collective, they can be very important for the conversations that the people like the ECA are having on behalf of exporters like us with government.
Yeah. So, sorry, Barry?
I was just wanting to follow up with that. It's importing is just as important, because we are sometimes our own worst enemy, and without knowing what we are doing to ourselves, we can't actually address that. Some years ago, I was importing microcrystalline cellulose, which is a free-flowing agent you put in shredded cheese that when we shake it out of the bag, it doesn't stick together and doesn't freeze together. And I was importing it from America, and at the time you had to have samples representative of the load that you were bringing. And the American people that were sending it to me gave me these A4 size, nicely sealed 15-gram sachets of fine white powder. And they said, we would like you to take this across your Australian border. And I went, I am not taking fine white, which is little sachets of fine white. And no, thank you very much. And they could not figure out why I wouldn't want to do that.
So I'm going to go to questions in a minute. I just want to, I'm going to try and stack the deck on my favourite issue, okay? So my favourite issue, my soapbox issue... No. It shouldn't. Given the situation, it should interest you guys. The EX188 certificate, who has to fill those out? The certificate of compliance and condition for processed food. It's basically, no, I'm not getting any hands, but a lot of people around here will. It's basically this meaningless certificate that says the Australian Government, Department of Agriculture, needs to fill it out, and it says, to the best of my knowledge, the above is true. And it costs $90 to get it filled in, which is less than you're paying for a health certificate, which is actually really important. And the Department of Ag will only accept it in Word format. And I've got a member who pre-sends about 20 of these things in self-addressed envelopes at a time because they just need to get them back and they need to pay for the postage. It is just the most manual process, and in this day and age, it's ridiculous, and it says literally the same thing as on an export declaration and on a certificate of origin. So please, if you have anything to do with this certificate, please log it as something that you don't like, because I really want it resolved. In this day and age, it shouldn't be an issue, but it is. And just echoing what Dalene was saying about the certificates and Martin was saying about the certificates, if you get the weight, so one of our members specialises in cross-border clearances into China, and he said the biggest issue that comes up is when people just get the weight wrong in between the 5 different certificates that you have.
So, for example, to convert kilos to pounds in the US, you need to use 2.20462. But if you use 2.2046, then you get the kilo to pound conversion wrong. I mean, crazy, right? And so those are the things that we have to make sure that we're telling government about so that they can address it with their counterparts. So anything that seems minor, get your people to fill it in, because collectively it could be something major that could be quite easy for our diplomats to fix if they're made aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'll get off my hobby horse now. All right, thanks, Chris.
Very good hobby horse you have, though, Heath. That's good. So I guess, fantastic conversation, and let's open it up to the floor now. So we've had a question come through the app that was around halal certification and non-tariff barrier, not just for beef sort of products, but is there any sort of explanation or any discussion you'd like to have around halal in non-beef type products and how that goes into market and being a barrier to entry?
So, as a beef exporter, it's really important to me that I have access to as many countries around the world to export to. So I have a choice. I don't want to be forced to only sell to the US or to China. So it's very important that I have access to Muslim markets around the world. And not all Muslim markets are the same. Malaysia is very different to Indonesia, which is very different to Dubai, which is very different to Riyadh. I sell to all those markets. All of those markets have requirements for a halal certificate. Fortunately, the Australian government has approved Islamic organisations. There are approved Islamic organisations in Australia that provide halal certification to me. And there are a number, I'm not sure how many, 9 or something now, that are approved Islamic orgs in Australia. And fortunately, I have the opportunity to make sure that I'm using the correct approved Islamic organisation for the market that I'm selling into. So I see this as an opportunity in that we have competition in the halal certification market, which is really important to me to keep the costs under control. And also that we, for example, into Dubai, I think that there are 4 out of 9, Amy will correct me if I'm wrong, 4 out of 9 approved Islamic organisations that I can access halal certificates for.
Thanks. So I guess to confirm, halal certification is one that's very high on our agenda in terms of a non-tariff barrier. Where we know that trading into different markets creates different certification requirements, and that every market wants to have ownership of the lead halal certifier. So it's not an easy issue. We're also aware that in some countries they're expanding halal certification beyond what would traditionally be considered appropriate for halal certification. So it's one that is going to be very challenging for all of us. We are going to have to work very closely, government, industry organisations on this, and flagging that it won't be easy to solve, but that won't stop us from trying.
Yeah, and I mean, I should say this is a really difficult area for the government. So I think one that the government would be really keen to avoid. So I know there is goodwill towards trying to address this issue, but it is something that I think industry needs to keep the government updated about, hold its feet to the fire about this issue, because it is something that is really, I've spoken to you or one of your colleagues about this, and just the cost and it is something that is needs to be addressed.
I appreciate the comments, Heath, but we should also realise that we also impose costs on ourselves. So, for example, our food labelling for priority foods, for example, imposed additional costs on Australian food manufacturers about displaying if they want to use the Australian-made, Australian-grown logo and the bar chart, there's particular additional costs in terms of that. So I mean, we have to be careful in terms of not being too critical of other countries in imposing requirements. That's their market, that's their rules. It's around, are those rules being applied in a consistent, most effective way? That's where we've got the opportunity to engage, rather than say, you shouldn't have this at all.
So if anyone is having difficulty with those Australian origin labelling requirements, make sure you feed them through and we'll spread them straight through to Martin. Barry, did you want to add anything? No, okay.
Any questions from the floor? Otherwise, I can go back to the app. I've got a few more in here, but I thought we have roving microphones. This face tech recognition technology is amazing when it works. So the next question was around what are some of these new trade barriers that we're potentially seeing? What are you seeing spikes in terms of barriers more and more through modern trade? Are there certain issues that pop up, I guess, more frequently, or things you weren't aware of?
So I see them as more, if I can spin that question and say, I see that there are solutions presenting themselves over the last year that weren't there even 24 months ago. For example, if we want to export beef to the US, we need a port mark. So we've got this beautiful sticker with a barcode on it that has all the information you could ever need in the world. But we also need to either hand stamp or put another stamp on it that has a set of numbers and letters on it. With the rise of supply chain tech, blockchain, for example, I know within the next, hopefully, couple of years, we won't need to have port marks on meat cartons to the US. And believe it or not, the Australian government or our diplomats have been working on this problem for, if not a decade, at least over 5 years, on trying to get rid of port marks. But what's presenting now is this opportunity in AgTech to solve old barriers with new solutions.
All right, that was really good, turning a negative into a positive. I'm going to keep a negative a negative. So a good example of something that's come up recently is the EU's general regulation on data protection, right? So this is cybersecurity, privacy, the European right to privacy, which they're very focused on. Which is all well and good. I'm a muesli bar exporter. How does that affect me? Or I sell wine. How does that affect me? Well, do you use e-commerce? Do you capture client information? Do those clients live in Europe? You're captured by GDPR, and if you're in breach of that, you might need to send 20% of your global turnover to Europe as a fine because you're in breach. If you want to comply with that, you need to have an entity within the EU that you can lodge all your sort of formal documentation and paperwork to a European regulator so that you can comply with that. With that. So Australia, we are not, our regulators are not sort of recognised by the EU in the way that some countries can. I think New Zealand's privacy regulator might be able to take the various plans from New Zealand businesses and that's acceptable, but Australian businesses need to have a presence in the EU to be able to send those to a European jurisdiction. So that's something that came up probably about 18 months ago, a year ago perhaps, which, if you're a food exporter, it just wouldn't be across your radar. But it needs to be if you're doing e-commerce. If you're trying to engage with your customers, you need to be aware that these sorts of things are out there, and if you're in breach, the fines are really big. It's something like 10 million euros or 20% of your global revenue. Anyone else?
So I guess something that's not new but is spreading would be the food safety or phytosanitary animal health conditions that are maybe they weren't always in place in some markets, and we had quite free and open access to go into those markets. But as those markets become more worldly and they start trading themselves, they start putting in place their own systems to protect their own animal, plant health and food safety, and they start introducing regulations. So it's not that they're new, although some interpretations of the way they do them might be new, but it's seen increasing regulation in markets where you might not have seen it before. And the other one would be an increasing conservative approach around food safety, environmental standards, particularly, I guess, coming out of Europe, and then Europe influencing others to put in place these very conservative requirements that might not meet Australia's quite strong animal, plant and food safety requirements. Europe goes one step beyond that into a hazard assessment instead of a risk assessment, and we're seeing that spread across into other markets as well.
Wonderful. Were there any other questions from the floor? No, we do have one more through the app. So in addition to the new database that's been wonderfully launched today, can you give some other examples of what the government agencies have in terms of offering to support new exporters? And I'll probably ask the panel, and then I can talk about what Austrade can do as well to follow up.
Thanks for the question. So within the Department of Industry, we've got a number of industry assistance programs, but in particular the Export Hubs initiative, which was announced in Budget 2018, which is looking at bringing together entrepreneurs, exporters in a particular region to harness their collective experience and share that experience to encourage particular more SMEs to take up exporting opportunities.
Thanks. So I'd say, as well as the portal to lodge non-tariff barriers, there's also a lot of consultation that happens between government and industry to try and articulate what the key barriers to trade are. We already have done that for a number of years, but we're looking at ways that we can do that even better at engaging with more than our traditional stakeholders as well.
For the exporter hubs, there are a number that were awarded in the first round, and 5 of those are around food and agribusiness. We are working with TradeStart as well as going to be working with ECA to help create bespoke training programs that are at 2 levels. One at the beginner level of what's 101 for export, and then for those that are professional exporters, what are those curly questions that are specific to your geographies that you really need to find a gap analysis on to be able to be successful in a new geography or somewhere different. So we're working to be able to provide national training capabilities for those that are interested in export.
And just from a really practical point of view, we utilise Austrade resources all over the world. So even though I've got a sales manager and he's got 3 sales team members that work under him, when we're going into a new market, we don't try and do it ourselves. It's really, really simple. You contact Austrade, you ask them to quote on a visit program. They've got a set hourly rate. Typically, it's 2 days to get around to all the retailers. Typically, that costs between $1,800 and about $2,200. Typically, they accompany you if they're available. Within 2 days, you've met 6 to 8 opportunities, and then you can take your pick. So it's surprising how many exporters are unaware of this service, or they feel it's too expensive. I would encourage you to have another look at it if you're not already using Austrade. They're very well connected in market, and basically that's how we've got our opportunities over the last decade, is just tapping into their smarts.
Okay. I don't know that. I'll second what everyone said. I'll also add, you've got the state governments as well. So the government of Victoria, Global Victoria, is very active. It's got a really great network on its own. Queensland too. New South Wales is getting there, I believe, Wayne. But also going to what we do, the Export Council, we give businesses the skills and expertise they need to do business internationally. We don't try and provide business with the market-specific knowledge. We leave that to Global Victoria, to Austrade, to a lot of other players. But what are the sort of the core knowledges and capabilities that you need to export, be it a business plan, understanding of market entry strategies, how does trade finance work, how does export documentation work, all those sort of practical things that you need to know as an exporter, regardless of where you're exporting to. Chris, I'll let you talk about Australia.
It's always good to hear positive words, Dalene, about Australia. But yes, before you do go to export, I strongly encourage you to reach out to your state government, but also Austrade. There are a lot of things I can do here onshore, and I'm part of a team, the agribusiness and food team. There's about 14 of us spread out across Australia. And before you even go into a market, we can really help add a lot of validation to say, yes, go to this market. It's a really good market. This is the average price point. This is the route to market. Or even say, maybe don't go to that market. It's not a good market for you. We're not seeing a lot of growth. Let's look at spending time and money elsewhere. And then, of course, there is the offshore network. Having 83 offices in 50 countries across the globe gives us a really good footprint to really help grow that export. Any final questions from the floor? Right. Oh, yeah, just one. I'll somehow throw a microphone over your way. If you could just introduce yourself before you ask a question, that would be great.
Thank you. Nick Collins from Ivan's Pie. So we're trying to slowly grow some export business. So we've got about $600 going into Singapore every month, a little bit into Hong Kong. So our challenge is around just the ongoing monthly fee to the department. $12.50 just keeps coming, $12.50, which, we understand being a meat business, we have to pay that. But I suppose that's our barrier. Then you get quarterly audits, three monthly audits quarterly, which we're happy to maintain our program, pay for audits, but there's periods where there's no business and we're still paying $12.50. So how does a small company... so when we go to shows overseas, amazing interest. Even in Shanghai, people were trying to identify what a pie was, but there was interest. That's our barrier. We keep paying it, but we know we can't last much longer while we keep paying. It's $30,000 a year for us, and the meat guys might lose $35 in a transaction, but for us, it's So that's our question.
So I mean, I would say make your voice known, complain, because you're not. Don't suffer in silence, because what the Department of Agriculture is really good at is the sort of veterinary sciencey stuff. It's got great people that cover that stuff. What it doesn't have is management consultants. And I reckon there is so much savings and efficiencies that could be brought into the export processes if there was just, that sort of groundswell of cries that, this is just too expensive. This is a huge barrier to entry for us to exporting. It's stopping us from exporting. It's killing our margin. Just make your voice known. It's something that I talk a lot about when I can. And any case studies I can have to back that up are very, very welcome. Absolutely. Yep. Yep.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panel. If you could just join me now in thanking our panel for giving up their time this afternoon. Thank you. Shortly soon, we'll have our next session on here. We're looking at more future growth opportunities for Australian producers. So we're going to be looking at some other markets and those emerging opportunities that will be in there. But once again, thank you, Heath, Dalene, Barry, Amy and Martin. Really appreciate your insight, and it's a terrific tool. I encourage you all to take advantage of that and do share those commercial impacts that it is having, because it is making a difference for us at the government level. But thank you very much. Thanks to our panel.